To understand how an empire destroys itself, you have to look not at its distant borders, but at the place it considers its very heart. For more than a century, France taught its school children that the Mediterranean Sea ran through the middle of France the way the River Seine ran through Paris. Algeria was not a colony. It was 3 French departments. It had French boulevards, French cafes, French post offices, and a million European settlers who knew no other home. But beneath the sunlit terraces and vineyard-covered hills, 9 million indigenous Arabs and Berbers lived as second-class subjects, disenfranchised in their own ancestral land. When that illusion finally shattered in the 1950s, France would fight an 8-year war of staggering brutality, a war that brought down its own democratic republic, pitted decorated war heroes against their own government, saw the widespread use of systematic torture by the nation that had drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and ended with 1 million people fleeing across the sea in panic, leaving behind everything they had ever built. It all began in 1830, when a declining French monarchy sought military glory by sailing across the Mediterranean and seizing the coastal city of Algiers. What followed was 4 decades of brutal pacification. Fertile farmland along the Mediterranean coast was confiscated and handed over to European migrants, not just French, but poor farmers and laborers from Spain, Italy, and Malta. Over generations, these settlers forged a distinct identity. They called themselves the Pieds Noirs, the Blackfeet, working-class Europeans who transformed the coastal plains into vineyards, built schools, paved grand boulevards, and established a life that was fiercely, uncompromisingly French. But there was a fundamental lie at the foundation of this society. Under the Code de l'Indigène, the native Muslim majority were French subjects, but not French citizens. To gain full citizenship rights, a Muslim had to renounce his civil status under Islamic law, something almost nobody would do. They paid taxes, they served in the French military in huge numbers, but they could not vote on equal terms, they were restricted in travel, and their children were largely excluded from modern education. When World War II arrived, tens of thousands of Algerian soldiers were drafted to fight for free France. They bled on the beaches of Italy and in the frozen forests of Alsace to liberate Paris from Nazi tyranny. They believed the promises made to them in the trenches, that once fascism was defeated, France would finally grant them equality. On May 8, 1945, the day World War II ended in Europe, crowds poured into the streets of Sétif, a market town in eastern Algeria, to celebrate the Allied victory. But alongside the French and Allied flags, a green and white banner appeared, the flag of an independent Algeria. A French police officer ordered the flag lowered. A scuffle broke out. A shot was fired. Within hours, a riot erupted through the town, leaving over 100 European settlers dead. The retaliation by the French military and armed settler militias was merciless. French warships shelled coastal villages. French aircraft bombed rural hamlets. Ground troops rounded up entire villages and shot men en masse. When the smoke cleared, estimates of the Algerian death toll ranged from 6,000 to as high as 45,000. For a generation of young Algerians, Sétif was the moment the dream died. Peaceful reform, parliamentary politics, dialogue, it was all an illusion. Freedom would not be granted by Paris. It would have to be taken by force. 9 years later, in the autumn of 1954, France was already bleeding. In May, French forces had been decisively crushed at Dien Bien Phu, ending nearly a century of colonial rule in Indochina. Morocco and Tunisia were demanding autonomy. Watching this from secret hideouts in the rugged Orez Mountains, a small band of radical young Algerian nationalists saw their moment. They formed the National Liberation Front, the FLN, and its military wing, the ALN. In the early hours of November 1st, 1954, All Saints' Day, the FLN launched 70 coordinated attacks across Algeria, bombing police stations, burning warehouses, and attacking military posts. Among the dead were 2 young French schoolteachers, Guy and Jacqueline Monnereau, whose bus was ambushed on a mountain road. The shock in Paris was instant. The French Minister of the Interior, a young François Mitterrand, stood before the National Assembly and declared, "Algeria is France, and from Flanders to the Congo, there is only one law. France does not negotiate with those who shoot at her." But the FLN were not interested in negotiation. Outnumbered and outgunned, they withdrew deep into the jagged gorges and cedar forests of the Atlas Mountains. They fought as ghosts, ambushing French patrols at dusk, vanishing into mountain caves, and imposing ruthless discipline on the local population. Any village elder who cooperated with French authorities was executed, his nose or lips sliced off as a warning to others. In August 1955, the FLN decided to cross a line from which there was no return. Outside the coastal city of Philippeville, hundreds of peasants armed with sickles, axes, and hunting rifles descended on European settlements. They slaughtered over 100 men, women, and infants in their homes. The French response was swift and terrifying. Army units and vengeful civilian vigilantes swept through the region, killing between 1,200 and 12,000 Muslim Algerians over the course of several days. Philippeville destroyed any middle ground that had ever existed. Moderate French reformers who sought reconciliation were silenced. Moderate Algerian nationalists who wanted peaceful compromise were forced to choose. A young French conscript arriving in Algiers was no longer just maintaining order. He was walking into a total existential race war. By 1956, Paris made a decision that would define an entire generation. They deployed hundreds of thousands of young French conscripts across the sea. Nearly 2 million young Frenchmen, mechanics from Lyon, students from the Sorbonne, farmhands from Normandy, were packed onto troop ships and sent into the sun-scorched mountains, tasked with fighting an enemy they could never see for an empire that was already crumbling. By late 1956, the French military had largely contained the guerrilla war in the countryside. Recognizing that they could not defeat the French army in open battle, the leaders of the FLN decided to bring the war to where the world's cameras were, the capital city of Algiers. The strategy was conceived by two men, Larbi Ben Mehidi, the FLN's political mind, and Youssef Sadi, the military commander of the historic Muslim quarter, the Kasbah. The Kasbah was a labyrinth of 300-year-old stone staircases, narrow alleyways, and interconnected rooftops, housing over 80,000 Muslims right alongside the glittering French city. To bypass French security checkpoints, Youssef Sadi turned to young Algerian women, educated, fluent in French, and dressed in chic European summer dresses. Women like Jamila Bouhired and Zora Driff concealed time bombs in beach bags. They walked past French sentries with a smile and placed the bags under the tables of crowded milk bars, cafes, and airline offices frequented by young European settlers. The explosions tore through limbs and glass, turning Sunday afternoon leisure into scenes of unspeakable carnage. Panic gripped the European population. They demanded total protection. In January 1957, the French civilian government surrendered its powers and handed the keys of the city to the 10th Parachute Division, led by General Jacques Massu. Massu and his officers were legendary soldiers. Many had served in the French resistance against Nazi Germany. They had survived prisoner of war camps in Indochina. They viewed the FLN not merely as rebels, but as a vanguard of global communism that could only be defeated by discarding conventional rules of warfare. Massu's paratroopers sealed off the Kasbah with rolls of barbed wire. Every resident was registered. Every doorway had an armed guard. But to find the bomb makers, the paratroopers needed intelligence, and they needed it immediately. The French army instituted a system of mass arrests and systematic interrogation. Tens of thousands of men were dragged from their beds at night to detention centers set up in basements, warehouses, and abandoned villas. Their interrogators used the Gegen, a hand-cranked field telephone generator, to attach electric wires to the ears, fingers, and genitals of prisoners. Water torture, severe beatings, and sleep deprivation became routine. Thousands simply disappeared into the night. Bodies weighed down with concrete were dropped into the bay from helicopters. A grim practice soldiers referred to with dark humor as Begierd's shrimps, named after paratroop commander Marcel Begierd. Militarily, Massu's methods succeeded. One by one, the FLN networks in Algiers were broken. Larbi Ben Mehidi was captured, interrogated, and hanged in his cell, officially reported as a suicide. Youssef Sadi was cornered in a secret wall cavity in the Kasbah and arrested. By the autumn of 1957, the bombings had stopped. The Battle of Algiers was won. But politically, morally, and spiritually, France had suffered a mortal wound. The writer Albert Camus, himself an Algerian-born French liberal, was torn apart by the agony of his homeland. When asked by a student in Stockholm why he did not publicly support the FLN, Camus replied with a line that captured the tragic essence of the war. People are planting bombs in the tramways of Algiers today. My mother might be on one of those tramways. If that is justice, then I choose my mother over justice. Back in Paris, reports of the torture could no longer be hidden. The French Catholic Church, intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre, and left-wing newspapers condemned the atrocities. The French nation was horrified to realize that 12 years after defeating Hitler, its own soldiers were using the very methods of the Gestapo on streets that were legally part of France. By the spring of 1958, the French Fourth Republic was collapsing from within. 6 different prime ministers had tried and failed to end the crisis in Algeria. When rumors surfaced that the government in Paris might open negotiations with the FLN, the European settlers and military officers in Algiers erupted in fury. On May 13, 1958, an enraged mob stormed the government palace in Algiers. General Massu and other commanders established a military committee of public safety, threatening to fly paratroopers to Paris and overthrow the civilian government unless one man was restored to power: the legendary leader of the Free French in World War II, Charles de Gaulle. To avoid a military coup on the streets of Paris, the French Parliament yielded and granted de Gaulle emergency powers. In June 1958, de Gaulle stepped out onto the balcony of the Forum in Algiers before a roaring crowd of hundreds of thousands of settlers. He raised his arms in a V sign and proclaimed the famous, enigmatic words, "Je vous ai compris? I have understood you." The Pieds Noirs wept with joy, believing de Gaulle had saved French Algeria forever. But de Gaulle had not made any concrete promises. A cold, ruthless realist, de Gaulle saw what the generals in Algiers refused to see. The world of the 1960s was decolonizing. The United States and the Soviet Union both condemned the French presence in North Africa. The United Nations was preparing to recognize the FLN, and the economic cost of maintaining 500,000 troops in Algeria was crippling France's modernization and its role in Europe. At first, de Gaulle gave the army one last chance to defeat the FLN militarily. General Maurice Chalet launched an overwhelming offensive across the country. Along the borders of Tunisia and Morocco, the French built the Maurice Line, a lethal barrier of electrified fences, minefields, and radar-directed artillery that completely choked off the FLN's supplies and reinforcements. More than 2 million rural Algerians were forcibly relocated into guarded resettlement camps to strip the FLN of any civilian support. Militarily, the FLN's internal armies were on the verge of total exhaustion, but it made no difference. In September 1959, de Gaulle shocked the world and shattered the military's dreams by announcing that the only solution was self-determination, a referendum in which the people of Algeria would choose their own destiny. To the officers who had fought for 7 years and spilled their men's blood, this was nothing less than treason. In April 1961, 4 top French generals, Chal, Salin, Jouhot, and Zeller, staged an armed insurrection in Algiers, taking over government buildings and preparing to seize power. But de Gaulle appeared on French television in his old World War II uniform, calling upon the young French conscripts in Algeria to disobey their rebel commanders. The conscripts listened to de Gaulle on their transistor radios and refused to march. The general's putsch collapsed in 4 days. In their desperation, rogue military officers and extremist settlers formed a terrorist group called the OAS, the Secret Armed Organization. Convinced that if they could not keep Algeria, nobody would have it, the OAS unleashed a campaign of blind terror. They detonated bombs in Muslim neighborhoods, assassinated French judges and policemen, and even tried to assassinate Charles de Gaulle himself in an ambush near Paris. The war had metastasized into madness. French soldiers were now shooting at French soldiers, while European settlers torched schools, libraries, and hospitals in a nihilistic, scorched earth campaign across Algiers and Oran. In March 1962, the French government and the FLN signed the Evian Accords, agreeing to a permanent ceasefire and paving the way for full independence. For the Pieds Noirs, the world ended overnight. The FLN issued an ultimatum that spread through the European neighborhoods like wildfire. La valise ou le cercueil? The suitcase or the coffin? In the summer of 1962, one of the largest and most chaotic panics in Mediterranean history began. Nearly 1 million European settlers rushed to the ports of Algiers, Oran, and Beaune. They abandoned their villas, their cars, their family businesses, and the graves of their ancestors. They stood for days under the scorching sun on the docks of Algiers, clinging to single suitcases, waiting for any ferry or military transport that could carry them to France. When they arrived at the ports of Marseille and Toulon, they were met not with sympathy, but with hostility. The mainland French blamed them for dragooning their sons into an unwanted war, while the French left viewed them as unrepentant racists and colonial exploiters. 1 million people found themselves strangers in the motherland they had spent their entire lives worshipping. But the most heartbreaking tragedy belonged to another group of people, the Harkis. The Harkis were indigenous Muslim Algerians who had served as loyal auxiliary soldiers in the French army, sometimes out of loyalty, sometimes for a regular wage, and sometimes to protect their families from FLN violence. There were over 200,000 of them. When France pulled out, the French government strictly ordered its military not to evacuate the Harkis to France, fearing an influx of Muslim refugees. French officers who tried to sneak their loyal comrades onto troop ships were threatened with court-martial. The Harkis were disarmed and left behind. The revenge of the FLN was swift, brutal, and merciless. Tens of thousands of Harkis were rounded up, tortured, and slaughtered alongside their families. Some were burned alive. Others were forced to swallow their French medals before being executed in public squares. The few thousand Harkis whose sympathetic French commanders defied orders and smuggled them to France were placed in isolated, barbed wire internment camps in the remote forests of the South, living in poverty and forgotten for decades. On July 5, 1962, Algeria officially proclaimed its independence, exactly 132 years to the day after French troops had first landed on the beaches of Sidi Frej. The cost of that century and a half was catastrophic. Between 400,000 and 1.5 million Algerians had perished. Over 25,000 French soldiers were dead, and 65,000 were wounded. 2 million Algerians had seen their ancestral villages wiped from the earth, and an entire nation stepped into sovereignty bearing deep, unhealed trauma. For nearly 4 decades after 1962, the French state refused to even use the word war in its official history. In textbooks and government archives, the 8-year conflict was sanitized under the euphemism, Operations for the Maintenance of Public Order. It was not until 1999 that the French National Assembly officially recognized that what had happened in Algeria was, in fact, a war. Like the Vietnam War for America, the Algerian War forced France to look into a mirror and confront the darkness within its own democracy. It proved that when an empire tries to preserve itself by compromising its core values, it ends up destroying the very thing it claims to defend. The grand boulevards of Algiers still stand, overlooking the sparkling blue sea. But the silence between Paris and Algiers remains heavy with the ghosts of 1 million refugees, the forgotten dead in the mass graves of the Aures, and the young conscripts whose souls never truly returned from the war.